You are very good at encapsulating the messages that companies need to know, but in a manner that was constructive.
How much is just tick box exercise and lip service, and Lord knows we've seen plenty of that.
We need to grasp the primary nettle of the purpose of the corporation.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, or IHRB. If you care about human rights and you are curious about the impact of business on those rights, then this podcast is for you. I am Deborah Sago, and you just heard from my colleagues, Salil Tripathi and Francis House. In this episode, you are going to hear their conversation with human rights expert Peter Frankental from Amnesty International UK. Peter has recently marked 25 years there, so we thought it was a good time to reflect. What's been the attitude of business towards human rights over the past 25 years? What have Amnesty UK and IHRB learned from our experiences of getting business to act responsibly over this time? And what part does constructive or confrontational dialogue play in all of this? You'll find out in this episode. So let's set the scene. Peter started working at Amnesty International at the end of the 90s. There was a sense of optimism at that time because the Berlin Wall had fallen, and as Salil says, globalization was on a great march. Right, let's get to the interview. Given that it's Peter who has celebrated 25 years at Amnesty, it seemed only right to find out about his route into human rights work.
I suppose human rights have been part of my DNA because my mother was a Holocaust survivor and she protected me from any information about her experiences, but I imagine I must have internalized them throughout my childhood. I was an active member of an Amnesty group as a student, and during the 1980s, I was campaigning for human rights in Central America. I've always had a deep sense of anger at injustice. So when the opportunity came at the end of 1997 to apply for a job at Amnesty working on business and human rights, I wanted to seize it, to earn a living doing what I believe in. It's been a great privilege, and to work with people such as you and Francis and IHRB, it's been a fantastic opportunity and journey, which I hugely appreciate. I feel very fortunate.
Thank you. No, it's a pleasure walking with you, absolutely, these last 25 years. Tell me what you have seen that you have liked, where have we got it wrong, and what has worked?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to have referred in your introduction to those heady days in the late 1990s when there was a sense of optimism. Clinton administration in the US, Labour government in the UK, people were genuinely shocked at the revelations that were quite new, and people wanted to see change. Civil society was much stronger. There's a real sense that people would change. And of course, then in 2001, we had the terrorist attacks and the sands shifted completely. With the war on terror, suddenly the West, which had been the custodians of civil and political rights, was seen to be conniving in torture. You had liberal commentators taking the view that under some circumstances, torture might be justifiable, the ticking bomb theory. So you had a very, very different situation. And it was quite remarkable that when John Ruggie took up his mandate in 2005, that he was able to get business and civil society and trade unions and governments aboard. On a tribute to his shrewdness, to the very strong team that he assembled around him, and to the fact that he was able to have numerous consultations, generate ideas, generate momentum, generate an infinite number of papers on every aspect of business and human rights that led to the adoption by the Human Rights Council in 2011 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, that was a watershed moment, a big step forward, because that gave us the tools to hold companies accountable. But if we were to ask the question, looking back 25 years, are companies any more accountable for their human rights impacts today than they were 25 years ago? I think the answer is probably not, because the UN Guiding Principles don't have traction. There's a massive accountability gap, new threats to human rights arising from technologies, surveillance technologies, spyware from the internet. So I think we have a very long way to go. But in having these tools that John Ruggie and his team put together, I think at least we have a potential that we didn't have 25 years ago. And I think that's the most significant change, that potential.
We shouldn't be too shy. These things happen because on the strength of two other things that were happening. At the International Secretariat at Amnesty, I was working on the Human Rights Principles for Companies, which came out in 1998. I joined in 1999, so I inherited it. But more important than that was what you and Francis did together to create a volume called Human Rights. Is it any of your business? So, Francis, I want to bring you in here at this time. Tell us about your journey into human rights.
Well, my route into business and human rights was actually through refugee work. That led me to work for Human Rights Watch on the Vietnam desk. That was sort of my route into the human rights world. And from that, I joined the Prince of Wales Business Leaders Forum, which at the time was really, I guess, the ramp up for many companies to start looking at business and human rights. So it was from that perspective, working with companies, that I first met Peter and our great mentor, Sir Geoffrey Chandler, through the Amnesty Business Group. And it very quickly became apparent to me that if we were going to make any headway at all in a lot of the things that we were trying to achieve, that it was going to be necessary to be working with business and have business round the table in discussion, not to be giving business a free pass in any sense, but that having gone from more of a sort of campaigning approach with Human Rights Watch, which of course is critically important, there was also a role for dialogue with companies and particularly sort of bringing companies together. So there wasn't a roadmap for companies who were looking to start on those very sort of early green shoots of human rights due diligence and so on. Through the Amnesty Business Group, it was to say, is there a scope to be providing, we called it a primer, is there a scope to be providing some kind of practical guide for companies from the perspective of Amnesty and the Prince of Wales Business Leaders Forum to be starting to sort of navigate some of this territory? So that was sort of really the genesis of human rights. Is it any of your business?
Now, let me take a moment to give you some context of a couple of people that both Peter and Francis have been talking about with me. Peter mentioned the watershed moment when Human Rights Council adopted the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, that came about thanks to the work of the Harvard professor, who was also a very senior UN official, John Ruggie. Ruggie died in 2021, but he had been appointed as a UN Special Representative for Business and Human Rights in 2005. He was also our chair at IHRB, and as a patron emeritus, he continues to inspire the business and the human rights community today. Francis also mentioned Sir Geoffrey Chandler. He was a remarkable man, a very colorful man, an executive with Shell in the 1970s, and he was one of the first people to champion the idea of corporate social responsibility. After leaving Shell, he became the founding chair of the business group for Amnesty UK, and that's where he worked with Francis and Peter. As Sir Geoffrey had come from a business establishment with a long corporate career, he knew exactly how to influence a company internally and in a really effective way, and so he could talk to businesses. As you'll hear, that influence clearly had an impact on the approach that Peter and Francis took at that time as well. You were very good at encapsulating the messages that companies need to know, but in a manner that was constructive and didn't seem like a hectoring, self-righteous tone, which human rights NGOs are often accused of, holier than thou. You didn't do that. You said, look, this is wrong, and change it. So tell us something about what you bring into that work and what you think has been working in this context.
I think in these early days, it was essential to do advocacy with companies because companies didn't believe that human rights had anything to do with them. So I think Geoffrey Chandler was quite right, and he was both our mentor and an indomitable figure in wanting companies to sign up in principle to the UDHR, the idea that human rights were within the remit of companies and they needed to respect human rights. That was very challenging. But then, as there seemed to be a few companies that were prepared to endorse that idea, we moved on to focusing more of our work on exposing violations and on looking at the regulatory environment, looking at obstacles to companies being held accountable, obstacles to victims of corporate abuses gaining remedy, and that was reflected in our outputs over the years. Now, as you'll remember from your days at the International Secretariat, Amnesty has very limited resources to address human rights violations across the world and across so many different themes, particularly so in business and human rights, just a small part of our overall work. So what we tend to do, we produce an output, we do a little bit of advocacy around it, and then we drop the ball. And move on to the next project. But the one area that's been sustained over a period of 25 years has been our work on Shell, and many, many outputs hammering at the idea that Shell were completely remiss. Their relationships with the brutal government of General Abacha during the 1990s, their failure to clean up their contamination in the Delta, to remediate communities that were affected, the misinformation about the causes of oil spills, about the extent of oil spills. And I think this work did pay off in conjunction with other organizations such as Friends of the Earth, who've also been focusing on Shell for a long time and resulted in some of the court cases we've had in the Netherlands, in the UK, where communities have received some form of remedy. So that's a significant achievement. But most of our work has been very one-off. And there have been a number of other areas. I mean, for example, in 2006, we produced a report on the role of Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft in internet repression in China. And then we started to have an interest in the UN-convened Internet Governance Forum, the rules underpinning the internet. But it was only for a very short time. And I think to myself, if the last 16 years we'd spent working on the issue of internet governance, and the failure of internet governance has had huge implications for human rights, for a whole variety of rights. But if we hadn't dropped the ball on that, the internet, we might have contributed, along with Tim Berners-Lee and many other people, to the internet being a much safer place. So, but this is one example of an output that was perhaps ahead of its time. We've also done work on the UK's Export Finance Agency. More recently, we've done work on JCB, particularly the use of their bulldozers in the occupied Palestinian territories by the Israeli authorities for demolishing Palestinian homes and structures. We asked the question, could the company use contractual means and technological means to help to prevent these violations? We came to the conclusion that they could. So many small nuggets of work that we feel took things forward, but as always, then moving on to the next project.
Francis, I wanted to turn to you because, you were in the mid-90s in Asia, and you probably saw the refugees kept in terrible situations at that time, on one hand, and you've been with Human Rights Watch, which as an organization is demanding and, with a strong voice. So I just wanted you to look at it, that of course there's a room for the campaigner, there's a room for the strong-voiced advocate, there's a room for constructive engagement. How can we balance that, and how can the civil society understand each other's roles better about the confrontational approach versus the constructive approach?
I think you need both. And I think the two working in parallel have delivered some remarkable successes. So some of the examples that Peter's just given of Amnesty's work, some of the campaigns of Human Rights Watch, of Global Witness, for example, critically important to create space, shine a spotlight, attract media attention, elevate issues to the boardroom within a company, but equally important around the table then to have NGOs and academics and others who are also ready to kind of sit down with companies and look at where there are opportunities and indeed imperative for stronger policies, processes around human rights due diligence, around risk mitigation, but also around who are the human rights defenders that the companies are talking to when they do their community consultations, when they go through their free prior informed consent processes with Indigenous communities and so on, how much is just tick box exercise and lip service, and Lord knows we've seen plenty of that. But there are examples where there has been more genuine dialogue. So I don't think it's an either or. The other thing I think is incredibly important in terms of the sort of constructive engagement side of the equation is what can be achieved with convening collective advocacy with a number of companies together around particular issues. Something we've done work on at IHRB on that is around the issue of the illegal charging of recruitment fees to migrant workers, a huge contributory factor to forced labour in supply chains. But that's just one of many examples of where there has been an NGO, sort of neutral, impartial convener of a number of companies and other stakeholders, unions and civil society on the ground and so on, as well as policymakers, on particular issues where there needs to be stronger regulation or better implementation of existing regulation to protect human rights. So, in terms of the charging of recruitment fees, there has been some progress on that. Around the Qatar World Cup, for example, reimbursement of fees by some companies, the Qatar Supreme Committee making progress on that. So both sides are really important, I would say.
What specific changes have you both seen over the last quarter century in corporate behavior? Are they more willing to listen? Are companies, one of the things I remember when we started out was that it was easy to have a conversation with a European company, perhaps also with an American company and a Canadian company, but beyond that, it was hard. How is it now with companies? Yeah.
I don't know that has changed hugely, Salil, if I'm honest. I think engaging Japanese companies, that has shifted significantly. Engaging Chinese companies, just talking from our own experience, that remains a huge challenge for obvious reasons. If anything, I'd say that's gone backwards. But again, that won't come as any surprise. I think that is an area where there is still there's still an enormous amount of work to be done. One change that I would point to is within a corporate structure, you have gone from seeing human rights being part of public affairs, being part of corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, even in the case of some companies, that being outsourced to their PR agency. Came across that, a number of times, and, just down to sort of reputation damage limitation. Whereas now many, many FTSE 100, Fortune 500 companies have got VPs with human rights in the title. That's a huge shift. But something that has occurred over the last year to 18 months, I think, and I don't know how much this is anecdotal and how much this is sort of the start of a trend, and I'd love to have both of your thoughts on this, is with this increasing drive towards legislation, we're hearing of a number of companies that are taking people from General Counsel office into the human rights and sustainability team rather than vice versa. And my question there is, does that mean that we are on a trajectory towards a very compliance-driven approach now to business and human rights? We all know that voluntarism has got its limits. We've all campaigned and advocated for stronger legislation on this. But if we are now moving towards a situation whereby companies, with the plethora of different national laws that are coming out, the treaty potentially on the horizon, EU mandatory due diligence, are companies going to be putting their limited resources for this issue very much into legal compliance and having lawyers there, which is nothing wrong with having lawyers there. But if it is people who are coming very much from just a compliance background as opposed to leadership and really shaping industry best practice, those two don't necessarily sit together. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
I'd bring back Jeffrey Chandler here, actually. One of the things he used to say, and Peter, you worked far more closely with Jeffrey than I did, but he always said that we want outcomes and not outputs. And I think one of the risks of the compliance approach, as I said, and compliance is necessary, such as having a zero tolerance policy on sexual harassment, for example, or zero tolerance policy of use of force by security forces, or zero tolerance for online trolling if you're Facebook or hate speech. I mean, all those are good things from a compliance perspective. A lot of what we want to measure is very hard to measure. When something bad does not happen, is it because of good conduct on your part or the state, or is it a miracle because of something else happened outside your control? That's something we don't know. So what ends up happening, being measured, is a process. So the compliance becomes a measurement of the process.
I think you're absolutely right. You both understand much better than I do the positioning where companies locate human rights. I know that 20 years ago, I'd get calls almost every week from companies seeking advice, and now I don't get these calls. Either they don't think I can give good advice, but I think it's really because there's so many consultancies, think tanks, others who can provide this advice, so many specialists and experts. That has to be a really positive thing, that there's that body of knowledge. I mean, the question is, what's the status within these companies of these experts? Are they just internal consultants who give advice? How much do they have the ear of decision makers? And I fear that they don't really have the ear of decision makers. Very interesting that you talk about a more compliance-based approach, because we see the limitations of that with the transparency and supply chain provision of the Modern Slavery Act. Companies are now expected under UK law to state what steps they're taking, if any, to root out modern slavery from their supply chains. And many, many companies do, as required, produce such statements. But on the other hand, when there's a parliamentary inquiry looking at the actual effects of the Modern Slavery Act in getting companies to actually change their behaviour and root out slavery from their supply chains, they found that this provision was lacking. So I think a compliance-based approach can be very tokenistic. It needs much more than that. I also worry that the involvement of general counsels may be to scupper legal action against companies by victims. And of course, we want to see more such legal action. We want to see cases against companies in many jurisdictions. We want to see it much easier for victims to gain access to justice. And we know that when there's a court case, all companies' human rights, principles, and ethics get dropped, and they'll fight tooth and nail, and they'll spin out those court cases over years, over decades, to stop an outcome in favour of the affected communities. And sometimes many of those adversely affected, say by silicosis in Southern Africa, they die before the outcome. So, yes, I do worry about companies taking a legal compliance approach, what that actually means in practice.
I think, Peter, just to add to that as well, is the rise of SLAP suits.
Now, let me explain what SLAPs are. SLAPP, which stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. A SLAP is a civil complaint which is filed against people or organizations who speak out on issues of public interest or concern. These are lawsuits which can be used to silence or intimidate critics or opponents, and they are intended to prevent any public participation or discourse. They have become well known for high-profile cases, particularly against human rights defenders and journalists, but they can also be used against almost anyone who speaks out in any way.
Are we likely to see an increase in that, do you think? Is that what you would anticipate?
No, I mean, I think there will be companies which will use SLAP to curb dissent and, get rid of whistleblowers and to restrain the human rights defender from acting in the interest of the community. But I think a lot of companies are also taking quite seriously the argument that is put forward by, RAFTO and Frontline Defenders and the ISHR, the International Service for Human Rights, the Resource Center and IHRB. All of us have been making this point that the space is shrinking and business and civil society to be allies. And even if you disagree with one another, there can be civil disagreement, but there is no need to, go after an NGO and make it bankrupt. In fact, one of the things I have, when Myanmar blew up last year and a half ago, when the elections were annulled, some Myanmar companies asked me confidentially, what should we do? I said, well, if your employees are out on the streets demonstrating, and if they are peaceful demonstrators, it is your responsibility to make sure that they have legal protection. And if they are arrested, to attend the trial. You don't necessarily have to, of course, if you fight for their freedom, that's terrific. But suppose you are restrained from doing it for legal reasons because you're partners with the government, you have to show and express solidarity to the employee and their family. And a lot of companies got that. And they said we would do it. So I again go into that half full or 1/4 full argument here that yes, it's possible to make a reasonable, very practical suggestion to companies that go and attend the trial. That's a very powerful statement.
And slaps are very insidious because we don't know the full extent of them. Because slaps are always they're always privileged and confidential. We don't know the extent to which media, investigative journalists, human rights defenders, campaigning organizations have been affected by them. And I think all we see is the tip of the iceberg. I believe that the fact that there isn't a lot more investigative journalists is partly because of slaps. This is not just defamation laws, but also privacy laws. And obviously, Amnesty is well aware of the extent to which companies try to deter us or delay our publications. And I think many other organizations do as well. I know of organizations who haven't been even prepared to put Amnesty material on their website because they felt that, okay, these companies might not go for Amnesty, big reputational issues, but they might go for them. So I think, there's a whole can of worms there. And I really think it's a big threat to the future of investigative journalists, campaigning, human rights defenders that needs to be tackled. And ironically, the UK has become committed to enacting legislation on slaps, but only because the media were prevented from publishing information about the links of Russian oligarchs to President Putin. So yes, when it serves political interests, government will intervene.
If we were to have this conversation in 2048, which is 25 years from now, it will be the centenary of the UDHR at that year, in 1948 to 2048. What changes will we have seen?
We need to grasp the primary nettle of the purpose of the corporation. We need a redefinition of corporations from being unitary entities designed to benefit only their shareholders, becoming pluralist entities designed to benefit not just their shareholders, but also to have positive impacts on society. And I think that means that the ground rules by which they operate, company law, the duties of directors, the accountabilities of companies, these all need to be changed. I think we also need to have fundamental changes in the governance of the internet, also in the use of technology. Technology presents a major threat to human rights. We're talking here about artificial intelligence algorithms, facial recognition, and other biometric surveillance technologies. We're talking about the monetization of data, the business models of companies such as Twitter, Facebook, Google. We need fundamental changes to the way the internet is governed. Without that, we're going to see human rights violations on an absolutely massive scale as a result of misuse of the internet. So there are many, many dimensions where progress is needed. We need to have a sea change. More of the same simply won't be enough. We need major changes in the fundamental rules that govern the behavior of companies. Otherwise, we'll see very little progress.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, Peter. And just an additional thought is we hear a lot about the purpose-driven company, purpose and values and so on. Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever, was on the BBC just this morning talking about in the current economic climate that, a lot of shareholders are reverting very much to primacy of profit. Just look at the record profits of Centrica, of BP, of Shell, a lot of the energy companies in the current Ukraine crisis. At the same time, they are reporting that their investment into renewables is declining, or at least not accelerating at the rate that they had previously set targets at. So I think the role of shareholders, at the primacy of sort of shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism, incentive structures within companies. I mean, all of this is happening, you look forward to 2048 from this perilous situation, I think, that we sort of find ourselves in now, geopolitically, and all of this is happening against an accelerated climate emergency. Looking forward to 2048, I think that is going to be the canvas upon which so many of these discussions are being had. But if I can just sort of conclude, I guess, on, I don't know if I would describe it as a note of optimism, but it is a hope that I hold that somehow increasingly there will be a push to have the voice of those people most affected, those people whose rights are most affected by negative impacts of corporate behavior, environmental human rights defenders from Colombia, with the exponential rise of renewable energy. How do we, for that to be genuinely a just transition and a regenerative model of economic and equitable growth rather than green colonialism and another form of extraction of value? So how do we find ways increasingly? And I think those of us doing the kind of work, Peter, that you do at Amnesty, that we do at IHRB, and many fellow travelers in this work, relentlessly calling for affected voices to be not just tokenistically on the odd speaking platform, but genuinely round the table in the discussions with policymakers. I think that hasn't happened nearly enough, and I hope that will really accelerate in the years to come. We have to be hearing more from some of those people most affected rather than talking on their behalf, which I think happens rather too often.
Yep. And, I do several podcasts at the IHRB with some of the defenders. We bring them in to speak at our course in Bergen that we run every year. They are the canaries in the mine. They warn us, they tell us what's going wrong, and not listening is something we do only at our peril. So as we conclude, first of all, thank you, Francis and Peter, for your time. Thank you for all the work you've done. And Peter, thank you for amazing leadership and continuing to be there. And all that you have said, and Francis, you said, mean that we will have to have this conversation. Well, 25 years is a long time, but basically it means that there's no retirement for us. That's all I can think of. So thank you again.
Thank you, Salil. Thanks, Peter.
And thank you both for being real beacons in the field of business and human rights, inspiring so many people. And I look forward to continue to work with you.
Absolutely. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Huge thanks to my colleagues Salil Tripathi and Francis House and our guest Peter Frankental for such a fascinating discussion. Clearly, much progress has been made, but there's still so much further to go. Thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, also known as IHRB. You will hear from us again soon, but in the meantime, do share and follow this podcast. If you would like to find out more about IHRB's work and how we can help business with human rights, then head to ihrb.org.